Hi everyone, this is Gary and I'm going to show you how using shutter angle to set your shutter speed in video based on the frame rate is a very effective way to work when using the video recording mode on the Panasonic GH5 Mark II camera. So let's get started. I have reset the camera to default settings and right now we're at roughly 60 frames per second in the NTSC region. In the power region it would be 50 and our shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. So what that means is that this camera is basically taking 60 pictures per second to make the video. Motion picture, there's 60 pictures per second. But the shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. So that really means that every single frame is being exposed to light the entire length of that frame. The entire time that that frame is existing, that it's actually being exposed, or the 1/60th of a second that it exists, the frame is being exposed to light. I'm going to set this to shutter priority. That's the exposure mode. So now my shutter speed is 1/25th of a second. You can change it in increments here, but I'm just going to put it at 1/25th. So it was at 60, it's at 1/25th now. So it's roughly twice of what it was before. So it's actually half. It's 1/125th of a second now, as opposed to 1/60th of a second. Now you can't see the fraction here, but it is that. So it's 1/125th of a second. What's going on now is roughly, I know this is not exactly the same because we're not at 120, it's 125, but now each frame, as the camera starts to expose light for that frame, it's only exposing light for about half of that frame. And then the rest of the frame, it's not exposing anything. So what's going on is motion blur is actually less at this higher shutter speed. And if we keep going more to something crazy like 1/800th of a second, the shutter speed is going to be the motion blur, there's going to be almost no motion blur and the video is going to look very choppy. And I can demonstrate this by changing my record quality to something like, let's do 24 frames per second. So you can clearly see this is 1,000 of a second. Look at how choppy that is. See how choppy that is as I move the camera? Now let's bring this down to something like something crazy like 1/25th. Look at that. It's very, very blurry. So generally speaking, but we're going to go back, we're just going to go to 38 frames per second and we're going to set our shutter speed to double the frame rate, okay? So 1/60th of a second, our frame rate's basically 30 frames per second. And we will get a nice balance of a good shutter speed with a pleasant motion blur. So I just want to show you how ISO is affected. ISO is currently auto. Shutter speed is 1/60th of a second. Now if I increase my shutter speed and make it faster to say 1/25th of a second, we know that we will have about half the exposure time per frame and our ISO should roughly double. So let's change this to 1/125th of a second. Our ISO went from 1,000 to 2,000. Now, so our exposure has been maintained, the overall brightness of everything is the same. We've increased the shutter speed and we increased it by roughly 1 stop, and the ISO, we actually made it faster by 1 stop, so we let about 1 stop less light in, and the ISO compensated by doubling from 1,000 to 2,000 to compensate that -1 stop of exposure reduction, and it increased the exposure by 1 stop, and now we have the same overall exposure and picture brightness as we did before. So again, as I lower that shutter, notice the brightness of that picture. Let's go down to 1/60th. It didn't change, but the ISO compensated. So right now we're at 30 frames per second, and you're at 1/60th of a second. Now, in the world of cinema, that would be called a 180-degree shutter angle. Now there's videos on exactly what shutter angle is and where it came from. I'm not going to really cover that. I'm just going to show you how it works in this camera and how useful it is. But before we get to that, let me go and change my camera settings. So what I'm going to do is, let's say I've been shooting 30 frames per second video and I'm at 1/60th of a second. My ISO is 1,000. Everything's looking good, and I would like to shoot at 60 frames per second because I want to maybe get some slow motion or whatever. So I'm going to go to menu set. I'm going to change this to 60 frames per second. Now notice, the ISO really hasn't changed, right? So things look okay, but there's a problem. Our shutter speed remained at 1/60th of a second. So our motion blur is not consistent anymore. If you were to slow this footage down to say 30 frames per second in post, right, about half the speed that it is right now at 60, exactly half the speed, your motion blur will not be consistent, okay, with your 30 frames per second shot. So of course, in order to fix that, you're going to change your shutter speed, right? Now we're at 1/25th of a second. Now your motion blur would be roughly consistent, right? It'll be basically the same. The ISO is compensated by going up. But notice how, in order to keep that motion blur consistent, I had to change the shutter speed. Basically, every time I change the frame rate, I have to say, okay, if I'm going to shoot at, 24 frames per second in 4K, I need to go and change that shutter speed to maybe 1/50th of a second. Again, that's in order to adhere to the general rule of 180-degree shutter angle in cinema. You don't have to do this, but it does create pleasant motion blur, and it's highly recommended. I'm going to change my frame rate to 60 frames per second. Okay, now I'm going to have to change my shutter speed to 1/25th in order to get that pleasant motion blur. Well, there's a better way to work. You can go to menu set, and we're going to go and enable shutter angle. So you go up here to the very top, exposure mode, you go down, image quality 1 tab, right, that menu, you go to SS/gain operation. Now SS stands for shutter speed. You click on menu set and you choose angle/ISO, and now you can half press the shutter to get out of the menu. Now you don't have shutter speed measured in time, it's measured in degrees, so it's an angle. Now keep in mind that nothing has actually changed in the camera here. Shutter angle is simply another way to control shutter speed, but instead of controlling shutter speed based on time, it controls shutter speed based on your frame rate. So let me switch it. You can go from 11 degrees to very close to 360 degrees. Now think of 360 degrees as each frame is going to be exposed to light for the full frame, and think of 11 degrees as it's going to be exposed a lot less. So it's probably much more closer to that really high frame rate. And there is a mathematical way to do it, but I'm not going to do the math right now. If you set your shutter angle to 180 degrees, which is halfway between 0 and 360, you are going to get the same effect as if you had doubled your shutter speed from 59 to or from 60 to 120. Notice the ISO is 2000, right? Now I went to 2500, but it's basically 2000. Okay? So here's what's interesting. Keep an eye on that ISO. I'm going to change my record quality from 60 frames per second to 30 frames per second. And now look at the ISO. It's automatically went down to 1000. We have gained a stop of light from going from 60 frames per second to 30 frames per second because we have a 180-degree shutter angle, which has now set the shutter speed to the appropriate 1/60th of a second automatically. We don't have to touch our shutter speed at all because we've got it set to shutter angle, which is going to allow the frame rate to control the shutter speed based on our shutter angle setting. So the ISO has now gone down to 1000. So right now we are in 30 frames per second. ISO is at 1000. It's an auto, and we're at a 180-degree shutter angle. So we're going to change our frame rate to 120 frames per second. So we're going to try to get some slow motion footage, and that would be 4 times the frame rate of 30 frames per second. However, the ISO would go up by 2 stops because the shutter angle is going to be 180 degrees. So 2 stops would be 2000 and 4000. So the resulting ISO should be 4000. So let's go ahead and go to variable frame rate, turn it on, switch this to 120, and confirm that, and then half press the shutter. You can see the ISO is now 4000. Our frame rate's 120. But the target frame rate, of course, is 30, but the actual frame rate's 120, and our shutter angle is 180 degrees. Now, let's turn this off. Let's go ahead and turn off shutter angle. Let's go back to seconds over ISO. Let's go and switch this to the appropriate 180 degree shutter angle. So this is equivalent. This is the 180 degree shutter angle. Let's go and turn on our variable frame rate. And again, we're going to confirm it at 120 frames per second, and then half press shutter. We've got a bit of a problem. the ISO went up by 1 stop, and our frame rate is 120 frames per second. So basically, it's going to be very blurry. So we have to increase that shutter speed again by a whole stop. We have to go ahead and send it to 240 or 250. Basically, it's close enough. So we increase it by a whole stop, and we now have each frame is a 180 degree shutter angle, right? So each frame is the 180 degree rule, and each frame is being exposed by half. And again, this is not a hard set rule, it's just a recommendation. It's a general thing. You're free to break this rule, but it's a general recommendation, and most movies are shot like that. But again, you don't have to do the 180 degree. If you're doing an action scene, you may actually want to lower that shutter speed or make it faster so that the action's a bit more choppy, so you can see what's going on more, and that is very common in movies. But again, notice how I had to change the shutter speed when I changed my frame rate. And so every time I change my frame rate, I'm having to babysit my shutter speed in order to maintain the desired motion blur that I want. So when you enable your shutter angle, you now don't have to do that anymore. You can just set a desired motion blur amount per frame. I don't have to worry about shutter speed. I literally can just leave it on auto ISO. I can change my frame rate as desired. So let's go ahead and switch this variable frame rate off and set this as something like full HD 24 frames per second. And my shutter angle is now controlling the shutter speed based on the frame rate. So again, shutter angle is nothing special. It's just a firmware thing. It's just a software thing in the camera. And these days, most mirrorless camera manufacturers do not provide shutter angle for video users. And it really is a highly useful way to work, because you do not have to change your shutter speed when you change your frame rate to maintain the desired motion blur. And finally, I want to show how shutter angle works with stops of light. So right now, our frame rate doesn't really matter. Just notice the ISO is 1000, and it is in auto. Now notice our shutter angle is 180 degrees. So I'm going to change the shutter angle to 90 degrees and watch that ISO. It doubled. So every time you double the shutter angle in degrees, so here we go from 90 to 180, every time you double it, you are increasing the amount of light entering the camera by 1 stop, and therefore if you have ISO on auto, it'll compensate by lowering the ISO by 1 stop. So let's go to 360 or very close to 360 shutter angle, and this ISO should be around 500. Okay, so I'm going to switch it back to 180. So just keep that in mind. That shutter angle, yes, you can control it with stops as well, but just be aware how it works. So if I go to 90, this ISO will go to 2000. Now we know that half of 90 is 45, so the ISO should go to about 4000. And then we can go lower. You're not going to get exact halfway here, so let's just say maybe 25 or 20. There we go, 23. And now it's stopped at 6400 because our ISO is limited at 6400, but it would have tried to go to 8000 roughly. So that's how you can see stops of light with shutter angle. So I'm going to switch it back to 180 degrees. Again, that's a very common general rule in video, is to use the 180 degree shutter angle. Again, you do not have to use this all the time, but you don't have to be at 180 all the time. But in most shots, 180 degrees gives a very nice, pleasant motion blur. But again, it depends on your taste. But it is important to be aware of how it works, and then you, as the creative person, can use it and change it however you want. But it's important to be aware of how it works. Feel free to ask questions in the comments, and I can definitely try to clarify better for you. So I hope this video helped you understand shutter angle a little bit better. And thanks for watching.